From Tucson, and welcome to the podcast show. We are a deep calling into deep ministry, and we so welcome you to our show this morning. This morning we have two very special guests with us, but before I introduce them, I do want to take a minute and talk a little bit about what's on my heart. So this week we are rounding up the Feast of Tabernacles, which will end up on Saturday. It'll be our last day, which is a feast of the feast. So if you happen to hear the sirens, that goes well with our theme today. And I'll get into that here in just a few minutes. So as we've been going through Sukkot, just to share from my heart and learning about what a tabernacle is, how God tabernacled with us, it brought me to the book of Jonah, quite surprisingly. And as I'm looking at Jonah, at the very end, when Jonah has his fit with God, and he's not happy, he's like, I knew you were good and a gracious God, and you saved these people who I didn't like, and he's fussing and complaining, and he lays down on the dirt, and a gourd grows a covering over him. Now, I didn't look this up, so my apologies, so I don't know where in the timeline Jonah ended up. However, I see now that gourd as a sort of tabernacle, because I never understood that part, like why a gourd, why a leaf over his head? Now I see it as God was tabernacling with him, or feasting with him, or coming down and having that communion with him. And so, of course, the leaf dried up and he was mad again. And pretty much that's where the story ends. But just some thoughts of how I'm seeing things a little bit differently as I'm going through my studies, walking through the Judaic studies. And as I said, I'm a Jew in training, so I'm a JIT, Jew in training, at a local synagogue here under a rabbi who is absolutely wonderful, and I so appreciate him. So, with that being said, I would like to introduce our guest this morning. We have author and editor Don and Kari Price, Mr. and Mrs. Price. Don is the author of book Cop Talk, which I have right here with me. If you haven't purchased it, I've been talking about this for a few weeks. Go ahead and you can purchase it Amazon, or just Google it, Cop Talk, and you will find it. If you're here in Tucson, you can find it locally too. So, Mr. Price is our author, and then it was nice to know that your wife became your editor. So I'm going to open up the show to you guys now too to dig a little deeper on this. So you wrote this book in the late 80s, 90s, you're saying?
Well, I started it. I think I did the first one portion of it back in the late 80s, early 90s. And just life happened, and I just got sidetracked and put it aside. And so it wasn't until recently when I started seeing all kinds of videos, YouTube, of officers getting hurt or killed, and I see what they're doing, and I'm like, that could so be prevented, but nobody's telling them what they need to be paying attention to. So I just decided I was going to write a book about it and finish my book, and so that's where we ended up.
Wow.
And since we had basically no budget, I couldn't afford to hire an editor, so I hired the one that I live with and love
and trust.
And I knew that she would be honest with me, and oh, she is.
Well, so that's wonderful.
That's how we ended up with it.
Okay. And I have to say at the very beginning, I do have to say, and all of us, I'm sure, do say thank you for your service.
Most welcome.
And not just as an officer, but we'll get into it also in the military. So I do thank all the military, all our officers, all of our first responders. We go through all of that, but I really do appreciate you. So with Mr. Price, with Don Price, I was telling them I would like to start kind of at the end and work our way forward because of your encounter in the 80s. So I think in the 80s, when you wanted to go into the police academy, how you encountered racism against yourself. So that's the beginning, and I want to end there. So I want to begin kind of middle towards the end of your time and your career with the academy. You were in California, not in Arizona, so you were in Southern California, and you're living pretty much your dream because you were kind of a teenager who really wanted to be a police officer. You could see this in your future. So bring us where you are towards the end of your career as a police officer. So one of your stories, one of my favorite stories in your book, because I do keep referring to it, is when you're being alerted to a speeder in the neighborhood. And the neighborhood families are calling and they're saying, there's somebody who's out there speeding, and our kids are playing in this street, and they just don't realize that this guy is speeding down the street and we can't stop him. So you have a great plan, and tell us what happens.
Well, to start, it was a real small department, and it was usually fairly slow. But this one Sunday, we got 3 or 4 calls of this elderly man getting in his car and racing up and down this little residential street. And basically the problem was they had no local parks that were near enough for the kids to go to. The school that was nearby, they had fenced off because they didn't want liability anymore. And so the kids had no place to play. So they would play out in the street. And this particular day, there were about a dozen of them out there, of several ages, from little bitty ones up to mid-teens. And this guy would, about every half hour to an hour, he'd get out in his car and he'd back out of the driveway and he'd smoke his tires and go racing up and down the street a few times, and then he'd park and go back home.
And you had trouble catching him because he would see...
He'd be done by the time we got in the area. So this just so happened that at that time, the car that I was driving, the chief had allowed me to outfit it with lights and siren, and it was like a little Mazda 626, so it did not look like a police car. And so I just started driving around the area, and finally happened to catch him as he came out and did his burnout and raced down the street. And literally I could have arrested him for it, but that wasn't my goal. My goal was to get him to stop doing it.
Right.
And I think all that would have done was probably be just infuriate him. And so I basically took the tack of, it's your choice, sir. I can either arrest you for reckless driving, which is a misdemeanor, or if there's an injury, it's a felony, or I can just take your license and submit it to DMV, motor vehicles, and suggest that they remove your driving privileges because I was going to put in the report just how many times he'd been doing it. He'd been doing it for a few weeks.
Oh, wow.
So he thought about it and got a little pale and said, please take my license.
Wow. So I love that you're able to show mercy in a way that allowed him to make that choice on his own. So there's skill behind that. It may have been intuitive for you, but there is skill in knowing that somebody is teachable and they can learn. And you had a pretty deep conversation with this gentleman, and it opened his eyes to some things that he didn't obviously think about or wasn't aware of, and it helped to get to this point. So you resolved the situation basically the best way anybody would hope for. And so I really admired that in that particular story.
Well, I think that's something that just the Lord would put on my heart, how to treat people.
Oh, okay.
And that was one of the things that always amazed me, was when I would have to end up arresting somebody, and after I'd get done processing them and everything, and I'd be going to leave, and they would actually thank me for treating them with some respect.
Wow.
And I thought, this is what it's supposed to be.
Yeah. Right.
Yeah, they might be violent criminals, but they're people.
Yeah.
They're made in the image of the Lord. Let's treat them with some respect.
Wow.
And I would always try to give them the benefit of the doubt. But it was really funny because most of the time they'd talk themselves into going to jail.
Yeah, there's quite a few stories that, as we're speaking, I'm remembering that you had some encounters where one gentleman turned around and smacked you, kind of punched you really hard, but he didn't know you were a police officer. So you ended up apologizing to him and resolved
I should have identified myself when I came up behind him.
But you were focused on the girl that he was attacking.
Yes.
And so I just found that really, really stunning to be from the eyes of a police officer when you're walking into a situation potentially very, very dangerous. Well, you know it's dangerous. So you don't want you know what you don't want. So you're working to the best optimum result.
Right.
And the way you handled a lot of those situations was just pretty eye-opening for me. So you have a situation where a gentleman is clearly assaulting a young lady, and you walk up behind him and you're trying to defuse the situation. You get punched in the face. Tell us what happens after that.
Well, apparently the guy had quite a bit of martial arts training, because when I came up behind him, I was coming up from his right rear. The girl that he was beating on looked up and saw me and said, "Now you're going to get it." And all he did was just swing around with his back fist, and whenever he did, he followed that up with a kick. And his foot was coming right up to my head, and I guess the Lord guided my hands, because I just caught it and basically raised it over my head. And so he was standing there doing the splits. And it kind of took the momentum out of his kick. Good thing, because it really would have hurt. It hurt bad enough when he hit me in the nose. But the girl didn't want to press charges, and so I ended up, it was up to me. And I checked. He didn't have any prior history of violence or any problems with the police, and I gave him the benefit of the doubt. And so I told him, I said, "Sir, next time you go to defend yourself, you might want to check and make sure it's not a cop." And he was just amazed, because he totally expected to go to jail.
And who did the girl end up being?
It was the guy's sister.
Yeah.
That
surprised me.
Yeah, he was beating on her because she was out selling herself for crack cocaine.
And he was mad that she was...
He saw her out there, and he just lost his temper and went over and started beating on her.
So he wanted to protect her by hurting her.
And the irony sunk into him later. He goes, "Yeah, I guess it didn't make sense that I'm beating up on her, because I was afraid she'd get beaten up on out here."
Mm-hmm. So hopefully that helped open his eyes, too, to understand he had a good intention. He just had a horrible way of going about it.
The emotions, I mean, especially when it's somebody you love so much. Mm-hmm. You really want to do something, and I know how that is. I used to be very angry and very quick to violence when I was young. And so the Lord changes hearts, and I'm really glad He does.
Well, that does bring me to the beginning of your book, where you talk about a gentleman who went through quite an interesting situation and a couple of scenarios there. So I'm not going to give a whole lot of information on that, because I do want the readers to purchase a book and to read this, because that first gentleman that you're talking about, and the policemen came up on a house and they saw a kind of a bloody mess, and how they worked with that young man and helped him. So I'm not going to give any more away, because it's a very enticing story and you just don't know how it's going to end up. And when you describe all that situation, it's very like, wow, okay, it touches your heart. It touches your heart. There's no way it can't. Now, part of your book title is Safety, Suicide, PTSD, and More. So not just cop talk, but talking about safety, suicide, PTSD, and more. And you mentioned at the very beginning that you start seeing police officers hurt or in situations that could have been avoided if they were just trained. And what really stood out to me was how PTSD doesn't have to come in a very intense situation where people are dying and what you see on TV and cop shows, because I love Law and Order, so I've watched Law and Order. I kind of went through the whole series of Murder, She Wrote. Sorry, confession time. So when you see shows like that and you just think, oh, they laugh off death. They laugh off a lot of things that if it truly happened to me would be absolutely devastating. But you had a situation that was clearly very, very intense, potentially very scary, it could have been very deadly, and nobody died, thankfully. I'll have you walk through that story, but that particular incident caused a reaction that you didn't expect in having to deal with PTSD yourself. So tell the story of walking into a domestic violence house situation, and you're behind a woman who is wielding a knife and attacking, I believe, was it her husband or her boyfriend?
I don't remember now whether they were married or not.
But they were definitely in a relationship.
They were in a relationship, had a child together, and he was cheating on her. And when we got the call, it was just a family disturbance. And the other, I was a reserve sergeant at the time. The other reserve sergeant and I were the first ones on scene. And as we walked up, there was a group of, gosh, I don't know, 15, 20 people. And it was just crowded, everybody up on this, near this porch. And so I ordered everybody away, and everybody backed away except for this man and woman, and I could see that they were struggling over something. And in the flash of a little bit of light that was coming from the porch light, I could see that it was a big butcher knife. And so, of course, when you're in contact distance with a knife, injuries can happen so quickly. It doesn't take a split second to inflict deadly damage. And at first, I was thinking it was the guy had the knife. And so I pointed my pistol at him and told him to drop the knife, and he just backed off, raised his hand, said, "I don't have the knife." And thankfully, she didn't stab him at that moment. But she was so focused on him, she didn't even look at me. I don't even think she heard me.
Yeah, you call it like she was in a tunnel vision type of situation, so focused.
When people are in super emotional situations, they get tunnel vision. And it can affect your hearing, your vision, and even what they're feeling, to the point where they can be severely injured and not even realize it. But in this situation, the girl was so focused on him, and the knife tip was no more than 3 inches or so from his side. And so she could have easily just made that shove and taken him out. And so, of course, I quickly switched my pistol over to her and ordered her to drop it. And it was about that time, I think it was, because he said, "I don't have the knife, she does." And her reply was, "You're darn right I got the knife, and I'm going to stab this cheating bastard." And that was when I realized,
wow,
this could go bad really quick.
So you have to analyze the situation, and you're right about the process of, now you have, what do you call her, like I wouldn't say the bad girl, but the perpetrator,
the suspect, subject, however you want to say it.
Okay, and now you're analyzing the situation. It's not an easy situation. You said there's 15 people around, there's children.
Yes.
And you know the potential of shooting her is very high.
Oh, extremely. I would say there's at least 90% chance. And where I was at, she was like, there was a 2-step porch, and I was down on the ground, so she was very short. And as I'm pointing my pistol at her, I realized that right in line with her center mass, which is where we're taught to shoot, there was a window behind her with 4 or 5 kids behind, standing there watching.
Yeah.
And so I had to change my point of aim up to her head. So it would have been horribly
horrible
carnage.
Outcome. Yeah.
Horrible carnage, and totally would have traumatized those kids for life,
But would have saved them.
But it would have saved them, or at least saved their dad, one of them anyway. And I made the decision I was going to give her 3 warnings, and if she didn't drop the knife after the 3rd warning, I was going to shoot. And so I knew my pistol well enough that I started to take up the slack on the trigger. I could feel it getting close to the break, and right as I was starting to finish the break, it gave her the 3rd command, and just all of a sudden she just like...
She relaxed
and dropped the knife.
Wow.
And so, quick, grabbed her, cuffed her up, and even one of the other sergeants asked me afterwards, he said, "Why didn't you shoot? I would have." I said, "Sarge, she dropped the knife."
Yeah, at the last second.
I didn't have to. Thank the Lord.
But you're so close, like to me, like I have gone shooting. I'm not great, but I can shoot the heck out of a Gatorade bottle. That's what I know. If you were, in that intense situation, I could imagine having the ability to let your finger go and not push it. So, like, that's just a lot of training. That's a lot of skill. So, man, I'm sure she's very, very grateful. The whole family's very grateful that you were the one who made that mental decision and had the physical training to not slip or just to go through with it because of nerves. And then you look around and you didn't know that you were surrounded by a whole bunch of police officers as well.
Well, tunnel vision is not a one-way street. That's the thing, is she was tunnel vision on him, I was tunnel vision on her and him, and I had no clue what was going on behind me or around me. And thankfully the other sergeant had called in for backup, and because especially when you have a crowd, the crowd can just turn to violence just that quick. It's
so true.
People don't realize how dangerous crowds are when there's anybody who's violent.
Yeah.
And they need to get out of those areas, because if you're not there, you can't be part of the violence or part of the victims.
Right.
So, yeah, it was nice to know that everybody had my back.
Yeah.
And that we all got to go home that night.
Wow.
Even the lady.
Now, you brought up that she had a knife, and like me, I would have thought, well, knife's not a big deal, until I started learning a little bit more, where more people are assaulted and killed by knives than guns. So actually knives are more dangerous of a weapon than guns. Is that correct?
Oh, easily, yes. And one of the things I address in the book is, for decades they've been teaching police officers what they used to call the tooler drill, and said that if anybody comes at you from 21 feet or less with a knife, you don't have time to draw your gun and take action against them.
21 feet seems like a long ways.
It does.
But it's not.
Anybody standing can start running and get a knife into you within about a second and a half.
So when you're saying that she held a knife 3 inches from her boyfriend's side or husband's side.
And so all it would have taken was one muscle spasm, and she could have just basically gutted him.
And so even if he brought her down at that point, he was already injured.
He could have been, yeah. And
wow.
That was the thing, is where I realized, okay, you have to have some kind of distance, but just don't give people a blanket 21 feet, because everybody's reactions are different. And your distance for somebody coming at you could be 30 feet. It could be 50 feet. But until you actually get out and try it, you don't know. And so I encourage all officers, and when I was doing training, this is what I would teach them, is get out on a grassy area and get whatever pads you can to wear, and stand there and have somebody start running at you from different distances, and see how quick you would be able to get your handgun out and address them before they could stab you. And they say, oh, I'll just back up. Do you ever try backing up fast when somebody's running at you? You're going to trip. You're going to fall.
Yes.
And then if they trip and fall on you with that knife, you still lose.
Ooh. Yeah, there's no win-win in that.
No. Knives are always much more dangerous than guns, but so many people don't seem to see it.
They don't understand the reality of that.
Yes.
So now that I've learned, I'm much more aware, so I'm grateful for that kind of information myself. So that I bring up that story to lead into, your subtitle here about safety, suicide, PTSD, and more. So incident goes as best as you can possibly imagine. Everybody's alive. He said we all get to go home. The crowd is not in an uproar. She is arrested. Her boyfriend, well, he hopefully learned not to cheat.
I hope so.
Or to find a new wife.
Yep.
But what happens when you get home?
Well, that's the thing, is no matter how much you try to compartmentalize things, we're human. And our brain, when we go to sleep, will start processing situations and emotions and things that we had while we were awake.
Which is a good and healthy thing for our brain to do.
However, for instance, the night where the guy punched me in the face, I didn't hit him. I didn't hurt him. And that night when I went home, got home at 3 or 4 in the morning, and got in bed, and my wife at the time was there, and I just rolled over and went to sleep. And sometime during the night I started dreaming that guy and I were fighting, and he punched me in the nose, and I hauled off and hit him as hard as I could. Only it was my wife. And so she ended up with a big, huge black eye.
Wow.
And for some reason, her parents didn't believe her when she said that it happened in our sleep. And I don't blame them. Who would expect that?
Especially back at that time when PTSD really wasn't talked about.
Right. No,
or understood.
I don't even think anybody had never heard the term at that point. That was back in probably 84. You know, earlier than that would have been about 82.
Oh, wow.
Yeah,
Okay.
82. So, yeah.
So an incident where, I don't know, it wouldn't make the cut in a movie. Like, they would have to really beef it up, and it would have to be really, really intense and all kinds of mess. And it ended up being fairly mild. I mean, not on your end, because your nose took a good beating. But what we would perceive, or what I perceived as, this isn't very scary, but it still was. And so your recommendation, because at the end of each chapter, which I really love, is that you have kind of a takeaway lesson, like what you can learn from it, how you apply it. Your takeaway lesson in this situation was what?
Well, what I suggest in the book is, if an officer has a situation where they come that close to violence, or they actually are in that much violence, and it's something that they're going to take home, and they've got a spouse, then sleep in the other room for at least 2 or 3 days, and make sure that they're not around if you end up having a nightmare where you are fighting this person and actually doing damage to somebody. Because I felt horrible about it.
Sure.
My generation were raised, you don't hit women.
Right. Wow. So that is a lot to go through, a lot for your family to go through. And you said your previous wife, so she was also a police officer.
Not that one.
Okay. Yeah. Okay.
I was married twice before I met Kari, and the first one, she was a stay-at-home wife, and there was the second one that was a police officer at the same department I was at.
Okay. And so your career comes to an end in a way you don't expect it to. And so you weren't able, as you told me, wasn't able to retire as a police officer, but I was a former police officer.
Yes.
So.
Yeah, I was a officer for roughly about 12 and a half years total. But because my ex and I were at the same department when we were going through the divorce, I had a lot of angst, I guess you'd say, because while we weren't like violent or angry with each other, there were a lot of points of contention.
Okay.
And one of them was the house. The house was in my name because I had bought it on VA, and her name was also on it, and she had agreed to sign a quitclaim so that her name could be taken off. Well, she wasn't doing it. And so I'm stressing over, I got to get her name off of this deed because she could sell it out from under me.
Yeah.
And so these kind of things were going through my head while I was at work. And this one night I got a call to assist another officer, and whenever he was at one location, I was at another doing follow-up, and I ended up confronting these two guys, and one of them, turns out, had 2 guns on him, and I didn't catch it when I searched him. And of course, his friend chose right when my sergeant walked up to say, "Hey, he's got a gun." And so I'm like, "What? He's got a gun?" Because I searched him. And so he says, "Yeah." And so I searched better, and there was the gun.
Wow.
And so I started to deal with that, and he goes, "Well, he's got another one on him." Okay, and so I dug deeper, and sure enough, he had another little one on him.
Wow.
And so because of that, they put me on suspension and sent me to the department psychologist to see if I was fit for duty. And the department psychologist said, after talking to me and hearing the story about my ex and everything, he said, "You're fine to go back to duty. You just need to start getting some peer counseling." And so I was all for it. But then what happened is something else came up. I don't recall now what it was, but it made me realize I could not stay there with her working there. There would just be too much stress.
Mm-hmm.
And so I thought, well, I've got a good record. Did well in the academy. And so I said, well, I'll just quit and move to another department.
Mm-hmm.
However, whenever I tried to go to another department, I tried 1, tried 2, tried 3, tried 4. And time after time, they kept saying, oh, yeah, we're going to hire you in just a couple of weeks. And then all of a sudden I wouldn't hear anything.
Wow.
And it wasn't until a friend of mine from the department called, because he overheard one of the lieutenants answer a phone call from one of these departments. And as soon as he heard the lieutenant say, oh, yeah, Don, yeah, he used to work here. You don't want him. Trust me, you just don't want him.
Wow.
And so I was like,
Feeling a little
wow.
backstabbed.
And the thing is, it's like, it's hearsay.
Mm-hmm.
So I couldn't, like, sue him for anything.
Mm.
And so basically I realized at that point, I guess the Lord doesn't want me to be a cop anymore. So.
And you were okay with that?
Yeah, I was okay with that.
Okay, how to process it.
It wasn't easy, but
Yeah.
I figured the Lord had something better in mind.
I think police officer is one of those positions where you so identify with what you do. You're never not a police officer. You clock in, you clock out, but you're never not a police officer. And it's just one of those jobs where it becomes who you are.
Yes.
So
Exactly.
saying goodbye and walking away, especially when it wasn't your decision, your plan, is a little stressful, I imagine.
Well, it was eased by the fact that I had been able to get hired as a reserve at this little town up in Central California. And so I was able to do a few years there, and so I was able to ease out of it. So
Okay,
so
good.
it wasn't near as traumatic as it could have been if, so suddenly I'm totally out
Yeah.
and have no more, because once you're trained in something, you just tend to do it. So
Yeah, right. So that brings me, I want to quickly get this story in because this was so cool when not being a police officer, living in Tucson now, and you and your wife are going to a local, was it a Circle K or a local Quick
Circle
Mart,
K.
and you see something, and it kind of sends off the alert of an officer's red flag, so to speak. Can you walk us through that story?
All right. It was a Saturday afternoon, and we had just left the Messianic congregation that we were having were at service,
Okay.
and we needed to stop and get some cash to go get lunch. And so we said, oh, there's a Circle K up over on the street here. So we drove, and as we were sitting in the car waiting to turn left into the parking lot, I saw a guy standing near the corner of the building on the outside peeking in. And then I looked farther, and I saw that there was a car parked back there and a guy driving the car. And I thought, these guys are getting ready to rob this place. And I pointed it out to Kari, and then the guy turned and ran and jumped in the car, and the car drove off. So I thought, oh, okay, they're good, they're gone. Well, I went ahead and got the license number, wrote it down, and went in to get my cash, and I'm standing in line. And as I get up to the cashier, there's 3 or 4 people behind me. And I told her, I said, I saw a car outside that looked like the 2 guys in it were getting ready to rob this place. I got the license number, so here it is. And all of a sudden, the guy behind me pipes up and goes, well, who are you? What do you think you're doing? Yeah, how do you know that they're going to rob the place? And I turned, and it was the guy.
Oh, wow.
It was the guy who had been looking around the corner. And I said, I was just telling you what I saw. I don't know what their intentions are. I had no way of knowing that. But all I know is it looked suspicious. There was a car sitting off to the side, and a guy's peeking around the corner, looking in to see how many people are inside. And then he runs back to the car. I just think somebody's going to rob them. And
Wow.
he goes, what makes you say that? And I said something like, well, I used to be a cop out in California.
Yeah.
And the guy got big-eyed, and I think he was, up to that point, I think he was going to start punching at me
Oh,
or something. I was expecting it.
yeah.
But at that point, I think, only thing I can think of is that my demeanor was showing that I wasn't afraid of him, and that if he did, he would probably not win. And I don't even remember what Kari thought about it at the time, because she was standing off to the side a little bit. And basically the guy got mad, threw his stuff down on the counter and walked out.
Wow.
And took off. And when I turned around and looked at the cashier, she was shivering and shaking and crying. And she said, there's been somebody robbing our stores, and the last one was last weekend. There's been one every weekend for the last 3 or 4 weeks. And I think he was the guy. And so I don't know if they ever caught the guys because of that, but at least they had the license number and a good description of the guy, because they had him on video. So anyway, it's kind of like they say, once a Marine, always a Marine. Well, once a cop, always a cop. You can't turn off that training.
Right.
It might lose its edge, but it's always there.
Yeah. And so you're just being very aware of your surroundings. And it seems like your wife has this intuition, either naturally or she's learned it or honed it because of your teaching, and you tend to be pretty aware of things too. Right, Mrs. Price?
I have become more aware of things because of his influence.
Yes. Yeah.
I will say that day was early on in our marriage, and I had not learned those skills yet.
Oh.
And that day, I was, like, Don was here and the guy was here. Don was a little bigger than the guy, and I'm like right kind of in the middle, actually. And Don was very focused, and I'm looking at him, watching him transform into this big, I mean, it seemed like he was turning bigger, getting bigger.
like the Hulk.
Very focused, yeah. And I'm like, what's going on here? I was clueless about everything that he just described. I thought, we're going to work this out, we're just going to work this out. But no, he clearly knew what he was doing. And the guy, they were like this close to each other.
Oh, wow.
They were very in each other's
almost nose
faces,
to nose.
Almost nose to nose. And Don looked at him directly in the eye and showed no fear, and the guy, you could just see him shrinking.
Oh, wow.
And realizing he was not going to win in this situation.
Wow.
So that's what I was perceiving, and I realized there was something serious going on at that point. But from that point forward, I was starting to become more aware of things, learning about situational awareness. And, he talks in the book also about code yellow, being more aware of your surroundings at all times, not having your face buried in your cell phone.
Right.
Like we see so much of that. And so, I'm thankful because, I do pick up on things I never picked up on before.
Wow, that's awesome. Yeah, that was a really interesting point of it's still going on. You're still always aware. So very last thing, and then I want to get into briefly, because we're coming closely to the end of our hour. So you said that you had done so well in the academy. You had a great record as an officer. You had a lot of respect. You had done well, obviously. I think you call it a letter to the sergeant, only when you make an error or you have to kind of explain yourself. But you didn't have very much going against you. You were quite great. And so the first time you're out of high school and you're remembering your dream of being an officer, and you go and take this test. And a lot of people are in there taking the test. They take the test, they leave. You take the test, and they ask you to stay. So you're like, okay, this is unusual. Nobody else is asked to stay. So you're staying, and then what happens?
Well, it was actually the oral interview portion.
Okay.
Before you get to that point, they have all of the written exams. They have the physical agility test. I'm not sure if they had the psych before that or not, possibly. And so then the oral interview. Okay. And the oral interview is basically what puts you on a hire or not list. Okay. And so when I went for the exam, or for the oral exam, I was working at a gas station, and there was a sergeant from LA County Sheriff's that was a regular customer, and he and I talked a lot, and I had told him that I had applied, and he said, well, why don't you come by at work one day and I'll ask you some questions and see how you're answering it. I said, great. So I went and met with him, and he'd ask questions and I would answer them. He wouldn't give me any answers. He said, it's not that kind of test. He says, it's just to see how you answer things and how you think. Yeah. And so he would ask me a question, and I'd tell him what I thought. And at the end, he said, I think you'll do fine. He says, I think you'll do pretty good. And so I thanked him and went on. And so what I basically did when I went in for the oral interview is I'm like, these are strangers. They don't know me. I don't know them. But I'm just going to talk to them like they're my friends. And the sergeant had told me that they're looking for someone to hire. So they want to give you the benefit of the doubt. So if you just have a good, ability to express yourself, I guess you'd say, and be able to think clearly under pressure, because it is a lot of pressure when you're in an oral interview, then you should do okay. So I just went in there. They asked me questions, and I had noticed that everybody was getting about 10 minutes average in their interview. And they were asking me questions, and what about this? Well, what about this? And finally, I realized I'd been in there about 20 minutes.
Wow.
And I'm like, what's going on?
Yeah.
And so they said, okay, well, thank you very much for your time. Can you wait out in the waiting room when you leave? And I'm like, okay. So I'll go out there and sit, and there's like 6 more people after me, and they all go in about 10 minutes. And they come out and they go home. About a half an hour after everybody left, they finally came and said, can you come inside? And so I went inside, and they were real nervous. I could tell that they weren't comfortable talking about what they were talking about. And they said, well, we want to tell you that you did really well on the exam. And there's 3 bands. There's A band, B band, and C band. C band are people that don't pass the interview. B band are people who pass the interview, but they don't have enough points to make the hiring list. A band are people who pass the test and have enough points.
Okay.
And he said, you're aware of the affirmative action stuff that's going on, because it was really starting to hit there heavier in the late 70s, early 80s. And I said, yeah. And they said, well, because we have to give certain people credit for just being what they are automatically in the A list. You are at the top of the B list, and if you had just a couple of things more in your favor, you would be getting hired right away.
Wow.
And they said, some of those things you can't do anything about.
Right.
But, and I like the way that they did it, because they didn't come out and say what those things were, but they said there are a couple of things you could do. And they said you could go in the military, or you could go get a degree in college. Either one of those things would have put you into the hiring band, and we'd be able to hire you. And so I thanked them for their time and went home. And at first I was really angry I'm like, I did my best, and because of my skin color or because of the sex that I was born, I can't get hired.
Things you can't control.
Things I had no say in. I didn't ask to be born the way I am. None of us do, at least as far as I know. And so I was angry at first, but then I realized it is what it is.
Yeah.
They gave me some options. I thought, wow, they didn't do that with anyone else. So I went in the military. And I was very thankful that I did, because I ended up getting into electronics there, and basically was where most of my rest of my career came from.
Wow.
So I could have been angry and bitter and held on to it, and done all my whining and complaining, but you move on. There's only so much you can do. You can't change other people's opinions or the laws or whatever. So you got to work around it.
Right, so you adjusted your sails, as a quote I was reading yesterday. Like, you can be an optimist or a pessimist, but if the wind's not going in your favor, you can have the choice to adjust your sails. And you did. You made it work for you. Yeah. So
I heard somebody say once, for things to change, you've got to change. And I thought, that's a good saying. That is very true.
Right, I have to take responsibility. That's not something that we like to hear. It's not. It's
not
fun to say. Right, I don't want to change. It's you. Everything else. So, and the world doesn't change and adapt to us.
Nope.
It's not an easy or fun lesson to learn.
Never has, never will.
So then you were basically discriminated against, and that's not something that's always talked about or whatever. And what I wanted to bring that up because we're seeing a lot of churches, and maybe I've just been my eyes have been opened recently, so I don't know how long this has been going on, but we have the woke left, which are extreme leftists that really, to me, they just hate God and everything that they can do to destroy family, to destroy your faith in God, and to build up the government so that the government becomes a source of supply for your needs, so government becomes God. I see it creeping in churches. I visit a lot of churches, so if you want me to come visit yours, just send me a message. But how do we keep some of that out? How do we keep the floodgates tight where we know that God's not racist, which is so evident when you look at the Jews, because the Jews can be anywhere in the world, any color, from anywhere, and they can be a Jew, which I think is just so typical of who God is. It's like he calls the person according to the character, and yes, there's some bloodlines there, but the bloodlines are not restricted to a particular race barrier. Yep. So I see God's heart as being all people. We see that. So tell me your thoughts on different churches or different pastors who seem to be more willing to accept some of these woke ideologies.
Yeah, it's sad to say, but there are quite a few people out there who are more interested in increasing their numbers than staying true to the Word. Mm-hmm. And God is not woke. God does not support the positions that they take mm-hmm. about very many things. Mm-hmm. And we are not supposed to conform to the world.
Right.
And the Bible's very clear about that.
Yeah.
We are supposed to be conformed to the mind of Christ.
Yeah.
And while Christ loved everybody, he didn't tolerate everybody.
Right.
As evidenced by him making a whip and chasing the money changers out of the temple.
Right.
There are places that those people are not supposed to be.
Yeah.
And it's the same kind of thing. The church is supposed to be set apart from the world. Mm-hmm. We are supposed to offer a breath of fresh air. We're not supposed to be just like everybody else.
Yeah.
We love everybody. We're tolerant of them to a point, but we can't just say what you're doing is okay.
Right.
As much as we would, it's not our position to judge anyone, but we can be discerning. Mm-hmm. And we do see evil and recognize it for what it is.
Yeah.
And that's one of my favorite verses is Romans 14:4. Says, "Who are we to judge another's servant? To his own master he will stand or fall."
Mm-hmm. That's good.
Yeah, we're not supposed to judge them. We can look at them and we can make determinations from what they're doing or how they're acting or what they're saying. But it's not our job to condemn them.
Right.
Because they're no better than us and they're no worse than us. Mm-hmm. We are all sinners. Mm-hmm. Some of us are just sinners saved by grace. So that's the difference. But
yeah.
God says to love your enemies. So how can you love your enemies if you're judging them?
So you judge the action, and you judge like, okay, God says this is clearly wrong. But Kari, we were talking earlier about even climate change. Something that seems like, we want to take care of the earth. I mean, for me, that's kind of like a no-brainer. Well, we don't want to be rude or unkind or destructive. So there's things that we can do that just make normal sense. They just take care of the planet God gave us. However, the woke ideology has taken it to an extreme where it doesn't make sense. But if you're going to be on their side, you pretty much have to deny facts. You have to deny science. You have to, in a sense, definitely deny God, because if there is no God, then this planet is all you have. So share some of your thoughts with me on that.
Yeah, I mean, the evil one is really good with word trickery. As we know, he knows the scriptures, as he's quoted the scriptures in the Bible to others. And, for example, Eve, he says, but God says you will not die. So he twists the scriptures. Even though God said you would die if you ate of the fruit of the tree of good and evil, he twisted the scriptures because he knew them and he knew how to twist them. And I think definitions of words and the intent behind the words used, even in climate change, is where there is deception.
Yeah.
Because you call it the evil side, I call it the evil side. Everything that hates God and what God loves. They try to trip us up by making us feel guilty for not caring enough about our planet. But they have ulterior motives.
Right.
And they want to reduce the population. There's that opposite thinking of what God wants, to reduce the population, and the elites have all the power, and they use climate change. Whose climate are we talking about? Are we talking about the climate that God created, or are we talking about the climate that the evil elites want to have, so they have total control and power? And they have a lot of methods to creep into churches, schools, and
the
people's
family.
homes through TV, television. They use words and words trickery. For example, when during the pandemic, we were told to stay 6 feet apart from each other, right?
Yep.
Well, they use fear. Fear is used very commonly for brainwashing and to control populations. And that 6 foot distance is subliminal for, think about it, 6 foot under.
Right.
There's an element of fear there.
Death.
They're experts at using words to form our thinking and our emotions. And as I've kind of delved into this more to learn more about how they do this, I've become very aware of it. And I would like to think that people of the church would start getting stronger backbones, if you want to say that, not just taking everything hook, line, and sinker, everything that they hear, just accepting it, and stop being naive. And realize there's a spiritual battle going on of good and evil, and it's become more apparent now than ever. And you need to sharpen your saw. You need to sharpen your spirit.
Yes.
And start asking God for guidance to see things the way they really are. Because that's one thing also from Don's book. There's one story in particular where things appeared a certain way in a case. It seemed absolutely horrible, bloody, and like, oh, this horrible stuff's going on. But you find out later it wasn't at all as how it appeared.
Yeah.
Don't give it away.
No, I won't give it away.
Little tease there.
Things are not as they seem quite often. They're not as they appear. And to dig deeper to find out the truth, we need to be truth seekers.
Yeah.
And really reach up to God and say, help me see for what it really is.
Right.
And not make instant judgments. But definitely be sharp. Stay sharp.
And that is one of my concerns in the churches as I've visited over the past several years and continue to visit lots of churches throughout Tucson and southern Arizona, is sometimes we think we're doing the right thing, and yet we're compromising. And I think if we come, like what you're saying, as a pastor or as a minister, the goal is to equip the saints, equip God's people. So as an officer, you truly understand that, and as you were a pastor, I didn't mention that either, so you've been a pastor as well. So you want your congregation to leave stronger, more sharp, more of that tunnel vision focus on what God is saying and doing in His situation. And I feel like that's lacking a lot, and that frustrates me. I feel like I want to leave better prepared, more aware of a tactic, more aware, like you're saying, words or trickery. I never even thought about 6 feet until you brought it up. It's like, yeah, you're right, 6 feet is that subliminal word. We haven't mentioned that in conversations throughout my life. Like, oh yeah, 6 feet under, whatever, unless you're in Louisiana, and then it's different. But in general, that is related to death. And so they're saying 6 feet apart because there's death there. They're just constantly bringing up death, where God is a God of life.
Amen.
Yes.
And so as our last episode talking about Here We Speak Life with the podcast with Robin Schwartz, is God is all about life. All He does is talk about life. And when it comes to death, it's because ultimately He wants life. So, not cutting down trees that bear fruit, if there's been a murder, you take care of the murder. If it's premeditated, then that murderer's life must be taken, because he took a life, and that's so valuable, and we can't ignore it. And so God is very much of a capital punishment in the sense of premeditation. So I've asked multiple people, ministers, throughout the years what they think about capital punishment, because I want to get their take on it, but God is very, very clear. So whether I like it or not, it doesn't matter. It doesn't matter if I'm comfortable with it. I have to be very comfortable in my relationship and knowing that God is ultimately the authority, and I submit to him whether my little brain can get it or not. So I love that you brought up the trickery of words and plandemic. Absolutely. And I don't ever call it the pandemic myself. I call it when the government locked us down, because that's really what happened.
Yep.
That is the truth. The government locked us down for a virus that is less potent and deadly than the seasonal flu. Mm-hmm. So when you see churches that are masked up, or we're closing down, we're only going to do Zoom, it really bothered me because, well, in California they had no choice, but some churches were like, we're going to stay open no matter what, and they took the fines. But some churches like, okay, we're going to submit. And like, this is the time to stand up. How are we going to be ready when a real evil like Hitler comes back? Because I believe there's going to be another evil person or group of people that will be like that, and we want to be prepared. So.
One of the things that I used to teach whenever I was doing the correctional officer academies in the interpersonal communications is I would teach them words matter. Words have meaning.
Yeah.
And I would give them this example. If I see a pretty woman and I tell her, when I look at you, time stands still, that's got an effect on her. Or I could say, you've got a face that would stop a clock. It means the same thing, but how is she going to take that? So you have to pick your words. One of the things that struck me a few years ago, how many times do you hear people say, well, in this Bible story, it says this. Mm-hmm. The Bible is not full of stories. The Bible is full of historical accounts.
Yes.
Use the word account. It's that simple.
Yep.
And it totally changes how people see things.
Yeah.
Because why should anybody believe Bible stories if they're made up? But they're not made up. They're proven time and time again by archaeological digs that what is written in the Bible is factual history.
Yeah. With other supporting documents.
Exactly. So stick
Which is
with
really
it.
Cool. Stick with it.
And don't fall for that trap of saying, oh, in this Bible story. Because
well, yeah, because we talked about that my whole life, Bible story. So I love that you gave me a different word to use.
Yes.
It's a historical account written in the Bible as well as other documents.
Yes.
And whether it's Adam and Eve, or it's about King David, or any of those stories that are, accounts, as I'm learning, can really help us to grow because we can follow their example.
Yes.
And it's not just a fable or nursery rhyme or a nursery story to pass the time. There's something of value in it. So, all right, well, we're very close to the end. So I do want to thank both Mr. and Mrs. Don and Kari Price and your church, because I know today was choir practice, and instead of going to choir practice today, you said, okay, we'll come in and we'll be guest on your show. So thank you. And your church is the Community
Christian Church of Marana.
Okay, Community Christian Church of Marana.
Pastor Dave Hedgepeth.
Oh,
Peth.
Okay, Hedgepeth.
Hedgepeth.
Okay. I would love to meet him, perhaps. He would like to be a guest on the show. He'd be welcome, so maybe we can get that arranged. We'll figure it out.
I'll twist his arm.
We'll use some of those tactical skills that you have.
Yes.
You know, that mind control thing. So I'll take this time to say, if you do have a church that you want me to visit, or a pastor or a minister that you would like for me to interview, please reach out to me. I'm very easy to find on Facebook, Tanya Edwards, Tanya Edwards, and you can find me on Facebook. I do accept all friend invites, so I appreciate all the ones that have been requesting me this past week. I have accepted all of them. If I haven't looked recently, so I will look again today, as I try to every day, and accept all friend requests. And shoot me questions, shoot me thoughts. You can email me, TanyaTucson@msn.com. This church who is hosting the studio and hosting our program is Good to Great Christian Ministry, and they can be found on Park and Ajo in Tucson. So thank you to Pastor Terrence and the gang, and a shout out to my co-host Simona, who is not here today, so we miss you. Thank you for all your support. Martine, who's behind the cameras and doing all kinds of stuff, all these fancy dances that I don't really understand what he's doing, but he's doing what he needs to, so thank you to Martine as well. So thank you again, Don, Kari, Mr. and Mrs. Price, really appreciate it. Any final thoughts?
Be safe out there, people. You got to keep your head on a swivel. Evil exists.
Yeah. Mrs. Price?
And at the same time, look up. see who your provider is,
Yeah.
and let him lead and guide you, and ask him for discernment.
Trust in the Lord with all your heart, and lean not on your own understanding. In all your ways acknowledge him, and he will direct your paths.
Couldn't have said it any better myself. So amen to that. Thank you from the Bereans from Tucson. We love you all. Have a very blessed, wonderful week.